All right, hey everyone, Nick here from Late Night Chess. Just wanted to continue our series from the last video where I covered knight and pawn endgames. This is also going to be a continuation of that series where we look more at rook pawn endgames with knights. What we're going to look at here, though, specifically is how white can still try and draw positions where black's pawn is actually on h2, or the second rank, or the seventh rank if you're playing as black trying to draw the position. So if you remember in my last video, we looked at positions where the black pawn was not one square away from promoting, but actually at least two squares away, if not more, from promoting. And we talked about this rule of the circuit. These four squares that if the knight could, oops, not that square, this square. These four squares where if the knight could get into one of them, he could just go in a merry-go-round, clockwise or counterclockwise, and black would never be able to promote or even push that pawn without white's knight taking it. But what we're going to look at in these next positions are actually not when the black pawn is on h3, but when the black pawn is on h2, or on the other side of the board, it could be when the pawn is on a2 as well. And those positions are a little bit trickier because the rule of the circuit doesn't work. If you looked at the circuit squares that I highlighted before, one of those circuit squares was on the first rank, so that if there is a pawn on h2, well, one of the circuit squares would not even be on the first rank. It would be even lower. So the circuit cannot apply in those positions. But there's still ways that white can draw if the knight and the king are appropriately in the right place. And I wanted to show you some of those ideas. And it gets to an idea called a barrier, where the knight can actually create a barrier between the king and the pawn that he wants to help support promote. And so let's take a look at that. So if we look at this position, at first glance, it might seem that black is going to easily win. Black's pawn is two squares away from promoting. Black's king is pretty close to the pawn, and it seems like he's going to be able to get there pretty easily. And look at white's king. White's king is way off in no man's land. And it's going to take a long time, if ever, for white to come help support the knight stopping the pawn. But even though it looks pretty lost, white does have one critical move that can help him stop the black pawn from advancing and force a draw. So if you want to think about it for a second, feel free to pause the video. All right, so hopefully you came up with the move knight g3. And this is a drawing move, and this is the key move. Moving the knight to h4 doesn't work, and here's why. The knight is actually creating a barrier between the black king and the pawn so that the king cannot come and support the pawn. And let's look at why that is. So obviously, if the king wanted to come support the pawn, he could not come to e2 and he could not come to e4 right now because those are illegal moves. The knight is stopping them. But interestingly enough, black can also not come to e3. And the reason being, if black comes to e3, like we discussed in my last video, the knight just falls into the circuit again. If you remember those circuit squares, right? I know I've highlighted them a lot, but if once the knight is in one of these circuit squares, it's just an easy draw. And if you don't remember why, go back and watch the first video where we talk about the knight circuit. So what's interesting to note is that this knight move to g3 actually creates a barrier between the king and the pawn. The king cannot come any closer, or else it's going to be a forced draw. I guess it's good to note too that if the king decided to come to say d2, well, my knight still gets into the circuit, right? And so really there's no reasonable king move here. And so black really has no other choice but to move his pawn to h2. And now we're in a very different position because that circuit that I highlighted before is now gone. So there's no knight circuit. And now the question is, can black just simply come over here and, pick at my knight to the point where I'm going to have to move away and then I'm going to be able to promote my pawn. But what's interesting is there's still a barrier between the king and the pawn. These two squares are obviously still illegal, but this square e3 is still not going to be good enough for black to win. If the king moves to e3, oh, well, obviously the king cannot move to e3 right now, sorry, because the pawn moved to h2, but let's say we have our king move here to c7. Well, black still cannot come to e3 because if he comes to e3, then simply knight f1, and I'm forking the black king and the pawn, and this is a draw as well. So even though this pawn has advanced to h2 and the rules of the circuit don't apply, all of these squares are still off limits for the black king. And what's more is d2 is also off limit for the black king, because if the king moves to d2, then I simply have knight f1 and I pick up the pawn as I'm checking the black king. And so this gives white enough time, because of this barrier, to move his king into the game and to help support the knight stopping the pawn. And so we'll, after the moves, king c2, right? So the reason why black plays king c2, if I just put these barrier squares back on the board, is, well, the black king needs to get around this barrier and help support the pawn. So he's going to do so by some maneuvering, either via c2, or maybe he'll try, d4 and maybe e5. But he cannot go to any of these squares. And so what we'll see is, black going to c2, and simply the king is going to come in, and the white king will be there just in the nick of time to help support his knight. And now this is a dead draw. And interestingly enough, if we go back to the original position, even when we put the white king as far away as possible, so let's put him on b8, there's still drawing chances here. So knight moves to g3, again creating that barrier. So the pawn moves to h2, there's really no better move, but the king can still come in to b4. And even if the black king tries to get around this barrier, let's show him going to d4. That's really no problem. King c6, the king's going around the barrier. He attacks the white knight, but the white knight simply moves away, and black is not going to be able to stop that, to take the knight in time. After he takes the knight, the white king moves to f2, and it's a stalemate. So these are really important things to know when you are on the knight side of a knight and pawn endgame. And if that pawn is a rook pawn, there's two questions you want to ask yourself, or one question I should say that you want to ask yourself. If I have the white knight and I'm trying to stop the black pawn from advancing, the first question is it on the second rank? And if it is, then the circuit rules don't apply, and I need to think of some way to create a barrier like I'm doing here. If the pawn is not on the second rank, then I want to try and create a circuit for my knight to fall into. And then if I can get my knight into that circuit, then I'll be able to stop the pawn. So those are all of the knight and rook pawn endgames. Stay tuned. I'm still going to have another video walking through how to defend against central pawns. And then also I'm going to show you some positions, although they're very rare in practice, on how you can sometimes checkmate the opponent, the enemy king, with a knight. With only a knight and a king, but you're going to have some help from your opponent. So we'll get into some of those videos. And then finally, the last video that I'll put in this series will be a series of a couple of puzzles for us to essentially synthesize all of the information we've learned in the last few videos. So hope you guys found this helpful, and I'll talk to you soon.